The file was found years after the war, buried in a locked steel drawer inside the shattered remains of a Canadian military storage depot. It was wrapped in government twine that had fused to itself with age, sealed under brittle wax, and stamped with a warning no archivist dared ignore. Department of National Defense, Canada Highly Restricted Camp 30. Escape plot to be opened only by authorized personnel. On the inside cover, scrawled in faded violet ink, lay a sentence almost too understated for what followed. The most elaborate escape attempt ever uncovered in North America. 6 months undetected. Engineers trained by the Reich. Hundreds prepared to flee. This is the story of the German POWs who dug a secret tunnel beneath a Canadian camp. A tunnel nearly long enough to free an entire corps of captured officers. A tunnel carved through frozen ground and hard clay by men who had no right to hope for escape. A tunnel that came closer than anyone in the government dared admit. It begins far from Canada, in the collapse of Europe, in the dark waters of the Atlantic, in the metal scream of Stuka dive bombers, in the long marches of defeat. By 1940 and 1941, as British and Canadian forces clashed with the Wehrmacht across continents, the Allies captured thousands of German officers, U-boat commanders, Luftwaffe pilots, Kriegsmarine specialists, and career soldiers. Many were men of technical ability. All were committed to their cause. The Canadian government, bound by the Geneva Convention, agreed to house many of them far from battle, deep inside rural Ontario. And so the Germans came, first in small waves, then in transports, then in entire formations of surrendered officers. The men did not arrive in defeat. They arrived with purpose. Their destination would become infamous after the war. Camp 30, located in Bowmanville, a former boys' school converted into a prison for elite enemy personnel. From the outside, Camp 30 looked almost peaceful. A large central building, tree-lined grounds, barracks arranged in orderly rows, a gymnasium, workshops, a parade field, a perimeter fence that looked modest compared to other wartime camps. But the calm was deceptive, because within those fences lived men accustomed to discipline, control, and engineering precision. Men who, behind their polite behavior and regulated routines, believed escape was not only possible, but a duty. The Canadian Guards underestimated them. The Germans did not underestimate the Canadians. They simply studied them, quietly, methodically, the way one dissects a bridge before placing charges. By late 1942, the camp population included experienced Kriegsmarine U-boat officers who had spent years navigating the Atlantic's deadliest waters. These men understood structure, they understood physics, and they understood how to turn the weakness of the soil beneath their feet into an opportunity. The plan formed slowly, carried in whispers across the parade field, exchanged in coded notes hidden behind chess pieces during staged games. They would dig a tunnel, not a shallow shaft, not an improvised burrow, but a reinforced escape route long enough to bypass the guard towers, the fences, and the open terrain around the camp. A tunnel that would lead into forest, a tunnel that could free dozens, maybe hundreds of trained German officers. A tunnel that could overwhelm local police, slip through rural Ontario, and perhaps even reach the American border. The file does not exaggerate. That was the plan. The work began in total secrecy, hidden inside Barrack 4. The Germans devised a cover that was almost perfect: the stoveroom. In winter, the stoveroom was always hot, always active, always noisy. Guards rarely stayed long. Beneath the stove, the Germans removed flooring boards and began chipping into the earth. The noise was masked by the crackling fire, by pots and pans moved deliberately, by casual singing. Loud enough to cover the scraping of tools, soft enough not to arouse suspicion. Tools were improvised, knives, spoons, metal fragments smuggled from machine shops, sharpened handles torn from chairs. But soon they needed more, and so they stole more. Hacksaws vanished, files went missing. Pieces of metal sheet and wooden planks were quietly extracted from repair sheds. Everything disappeared in ones and twos. Nothing disappeared in bulk. The Canadians assumed poor inventory. The Germans assumed the guards would eventually notice. They did not. The tunnel grew. It sloped down at a precise angle, engineered by former naval officers who had calculated descent rates inside U-boats for a decade. It curved to avoid drainage pipes. It crossed beneath a yard the guards walked through countless times each day. The deeper the Germans dug, the more complex the project became. The frozen Canadian soil was unforgiving. Winter turned the ground into a cement slab. Spring thaw flooded the lower chambers. The walls needed reinforcement, so they built supports. They stole bed slats, breaking them down into beams. They removed wooden pieces from unused furniture. They fabricated joints like carpenters. The supports were installed one by one, forming a rib cage inside the earth. Ventilation became a problem next. A tunnel this long needed air, so they created a pump using tin cans and repurposed cloth powered by manual effort. It wheezed softly in the darkness, a heartbeat beneath the barracks. Lighting followed. Wires were smuggled in. Batteries were appropriated under the guise of radio experiments. Some later files indicate they siphoned electricity from the camp's supply. Others say they used lanterns with covers to shield light from above. Guards never caught on. The Germans organized work teams, diggers, haulers, ventilation crews, engineers, signal lookouts. Every man had a function. Every voice was controlled. Every hour was planned. When earth had to be removed, it was done with stealth. The soil was stuffed into pillowcases, hidden inside boots, spread along garden paths, dumped beneath the barracks, or flushed in small amounts into drainage channels. At night, prisoners sprinkled excavated earth into the camp gardens under the guise of gardening privileges. Soil scientists estimate that tons of earth moved without detection. While they dug, they planned escape logistics with characteristic German thoroughness. Maps were hand-drawn. Compasses were built from razor blades and magnetized needles. Clothing was modified into civilian outfits using bed linens and dyed cloth. Fake identification was handcrafted. Food was rationed. Coded signals were created. Meeting points were defined outside the camp. Their goal was not small. They envisioned a breakout numbering dozens, possibly hundreds of officers escaping into rural Ontario, seizing cars, moving at night along back roads, splitting into teams and heading south. The nearest border was hundreds of kilometers away, but to men who once crossed the Atlantic in steel tubes beneath destroyers, nothing seemed insurmountable. The tunnel stretched farther every week, 10 feet, 20, 40, 70, 90. By January 1943, it had reached a staggering length, nearly 150 feet according to later measurements, long enough to pass beneath the outer fences and approach the tree line. The Germans celebrated quietly inside Barrack 4 with coffee brewed from scavenged beans and toasted bread browned on the stove that concealed the entrance. Everything appeared perfect. But in war, perfection rarely survives contact with chance. What happened next has two versions, one from Canadian records, one from German testimonies. Each blames coincidence. Each blames small mistakes. Canadian guards had noticed unusual foot traffic around Barrack 4. A sergeant thought the stove ran too hot for the mild weather. A corporal heard a hollow sound beneath the floorboards. A watchdog paused and sniffed the foundation during a routine patrol. An engineer questioned why the camp's electrical usage fluctuated each evening. Individually, the signs were nothing. Together, they were everything. On a cold February morning, Canadian officers ordered a surprise inspection. The prisoners acted calm. They were trained to. The barracks looked ordinary. Beds neat, books stacked, stove burning. But something caught an officer's eye. A faint outline under the stovepipe, almost invisible, a slight seam where the boards no longer sat flush. He tapped it with a boot. The wood echoed differently, hollow. The guard called for a crowbar. 20 minutes later, the entire top of the tunnel was exposed. Underneath, a deep shaft disappeared into darkness, framed by wooden supports like the ribs of a buried ship. Wires ran along its length. Air ducts jutted from the walls. A faint lantern flickered at the far end where a team of German POWs froze in mid-dig, caught in the beam of Canadian flashlights. The camp erupted. Guards shouted, prisoners surged, sirens wailed. The tunnelers were dragged up, covered in clay and shock. The Canadian officers walked the length of the tunnel the next morning under heavy guard. Their report, preserved in the file, bordered on disbelief. Structural integrity consistent with professional engineering. Support beams spaced mathematically. Ventilation adequate. Lighting system improvised with ingenuity. Tunnel runs beyond inner perimeter fence, intended for mass escape. The tunnel was destroyed within hours, blown in by Canadian engineers who used shovels and sandbags rather than explosives to avoid killing men still nearby. News of the discovery was kept quiet. The public was never told that North America came within days of the largest POW breakout in its history. Inside the camp, morale collapsed among the German prisoners. Interrogations followed. Some officers admitted to minor roles. None confessed to leadership. The Geneva Convention prevented severe punishment, but security tightened dramatically. The Canadian Guards, many of whom had dismissed the POWs as proud but harmless officers, revised their assumptions overnight. The Germans were not passive. They were patient, methodical, disciplined, dangerous. Camp 30 would later be the site of the infamous Battle of Bowmanville, where prisoners and guards clashed in hand-to-hand fighting over shackling orders for U-boat crews. But the tunnel had already defined the camp's legend. Today, only fragments remain. Decaying foundations, cracked pavement where barracks once stood. Silent earth hiding the ghosts of a tunnel meticulously erased. But if you stand there in winter when the ground is hard and the wind whistles across the field, you might still feel the faint echo of what lay beneath. A hollow beneath your boots where hundreds of men once pinned their hopes on a passage to freedom. A tunnel dug by German POWs in a quiet corner of Canada. A tunnel nearly long enough to breach the perimeter. A tunnel almost capable of altering homefront history. The most daring escape attempt ever made on North American soil. A plan undone not by incompetence nor betrayal nor a guard's brilliance, but by the smallest misalignment in a floorboard, a dog's curiosity, and the cold truth that even the most perfect plans are vulnerable to chance. This was Camp 30. This was the tunnel under Bowmanville. This was the escape that almost succeeded. The one that North America wasn't meant to remember.